The sun was just beginning to set on a cold Tuesday evening in November of the year 1925. John Baker walked down the quiet, tree-lined street toward his small house. He wore a heavy wool coat against the biting wind. The brown leaves on the ground crunched under his thick leather shoes. John was a young man, but he lived a very quiet and serious life. He did not go to parties. He did not go to the moving pictures. He did not spend his time in crowded restaurants. He worked all day as a clerk at a bank downtown, counting paper money and stamping ink on forms. He smiled at his neighbours, but he never stopped to talk for very long. He was always in a hurry to get back to his house. His house was a simple two-story wooden building painted a dull grey. It had a small porch in the front and a steep roof. But John did not care about the porch or the living room or the kitchen. He only cared about the space just under the steep roof. He only cared about his attic. When John reached his front door, he took a heavy brass key from his pocket and unlocked it. He stepped inside and closed the door quickly to keep the cold wind out. The house was completely silent. He lived alone. He hung his heavy wool coat on a wooden peg near the door and placed his hat on a small table. He walked into the kitchen to prepare his evening meal. He did this every single day. He followed the exact same routine so that he would not have to waste any time thinking about it. He lit the small stove and heated a pot of simple vegetable soup. He sliced a thick piece of plain bread. He sat at his small kitchen table and ate his food in the fading light of the evening. He chewed his bread slowly, watching the sun disappear below the trees through the kitchen window. The sky turned from pale blue to a deep, dark purple. Night was coming. For most people, night meant it was time to rest. For John Baker, night meant it was time to wake up. Night was when the air was clear. Night was when the signals travelled the farthest. John finished his soup and washed his bowl in the sink, scrubbing it with a rough cloth until it was perfectly clean. He dried his hands on a towel and walked out of the kitchen. He walked down the narrow hallway and stopped at the bottom of a steep set of wooden stairs. These stairs led up to the attic. The door at the top was closed. John took a deep breath. A feeling of excitement washed over him, just like it did every single evening. He placed his foot on the bottom step and began to climb. The wooden boards creaked under his weight. The air grew slightly colder with each step. When he reached the top, he turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The attic was a large open space. The roof slanted down on both sides, making the room feel like a tent made of old wood. The air smelled of dry dust, old timber, and a strange sharp scent, like the air right after a lightning storm. John reached up and pulled a thin string hanging from the ceiling. A single bare light bulb clicked on, filling the centre of the room with a dim yellow glow. The corners of the attic remained completely hidden in deep shadows. The light bulb swayed gently on its wire, making the shadows dance slightly against the wooden walls. In the very centre of the room, directly under the light, was a large wooden table. This table was John's entire world. It was covered with tools, wires, metal plates, and glass tubes. This was his amateur radio station. In 1925, the radio was still a very new and magical thing to most people. Families would buy beautiful wooden boxes with fabric speakers to put in their living rooms. They would sit around these boxes and listen to local music or comedy shows. But John did not want to buy a radio from a store. He wanted to build his own. And he did not just want to hear the local music from the city. He wanted to push the limits of what a radio could do. He was totally obsessed with pulling invisible sounds out of the empty air. He spent every spare penny he earned at the bank on new parts. John walked over to the table and pulled out a simple wooden chair. He sat down and looked at his machine. It was a beautiful, complicated mess. He had built a highly sensitive crystal radio receiver, but he had added many custom parts to make it more powerful than anything a normal person could buy. At the front of the wooden board was the crystal detector. It was a small, shiny piece of mineral called galena, held tightly in a metal cup. Resting gently against the surface of this rock was a very thin, sharp piece of wire. Radio operators called this wire the cat's whisker. By moving the tiny wire across the rough surface of the rock, John could catch different radio waves bouncing through the sky. Behind the crystal were 3 large, round cardboard tubes. John had spent weeks carefully wrapping hundreds of feet of shiny copper wire around these tubes. The wire was pulled tight, row after row, perfectly spaced. These were his tuning coils. They helped the radio focus on specific invisible waves. And behind the coils stood the most expensive parts of all. There were 4 large glass vacuum tubes plugged into black bases. They looked like oversized light bulbs, but they had complex metal screens and plates inside them. These tubes were designed to take the tiny, weak signals caught by the crystal and make them much stronger. A tangle of colourful wires connected all these parts to a row of heavy black batteries sitting on the floor under the table. John took his heavy headphones from the table. They had thick leather pads that completely covered his ears, and a stiff metal band that went over his head. He placed them on his head and adjusted them until they were tight. They blocked out the silence of the house. He reached out and grabbed the main power switch. It was a heavy metal lever mounted on a block of black rubber. He pulled the lever down with a loud click. Under the table, the batteries began to send electricity up through the wires. On the table, the 4 large glass vacuum tubes slowly began to warm up. A soft, warm orange glow appeared inside the glass. The sharp smell of hot dust and electricity grew stronger in the room. John leaned forward. He heard a soft, rushing sound in his headphones. It sounded like a gentle wind blowing through dry leaves. This was the natural static of the atmosphere. It meant the radio was alive and listening. He reached out and carefully grabbed the small wooden handle that moved the cat's whisker. He dragged the tiny wire across the shiny rock. The rushing sound in his ears changed pitch. It hissed and popped. Suddenly, a voice broke through the noise. It was a man talking about the price of corn. John had found a local station. The signal was very strong and clear, thanks to his powerful glass tubes. But John did not care about the price of corn. He carefully moved the tiny wire again. The voice vanished back into the rushing static. A moment later, music filled John's ears. It was a jazz band playing in a hotel in Chicago. He could hear the bright, sharp notes of a trumpet and the steady, thumping beat of a drum. For a normal radio operator, catching a signal from Chicago would be a great victory for the night. They would sit back and enjoy the music. But John was not a normal operator. He did not want music. He wanted to hear what was hiding past the music. He wanted to hear the empty spaces between the stations. He moved the cat's whisker again, dragging it toward the very edge of the crystal. He reached out to a large black dial connected to his copper coils. He turned it slowly. He passed a station playing a piano song. He passed a newsman talking about a factory fire in New York. He passed a man giving a sermon from a church in Philadelphia. He kept turning the dial, pushing the radio past the normal frequencies. He was pushing his machine to its absolute limit. The numbers on the black dial ran out, but he kept turning until the mechanism hit the stopping pin. He was now listening to a part of the radio spectrum that most people never reached. The headphones were mostly quiet now. There was no music. There were no newsmen. There was only the hissing and popping of natural static. John closed his eyes and concentrated on the sound. He sat like a statue in his wooden chair, bathed in the dim yellow light of the overhead bulb and the orange glow of the vacuum tubes. He listened to the static for a long time. It was a relaxing sound to him. It was the sound of the vast, empty sky. He waited patiently to see if a random, distant signal from halfway across the world might bounce off the atmosphere and travel down his copper wire. After about 20 minutes, the sound in his headphones began to change. The normal random popping of the static started to slow down. The rushing wind sound dropped lower and lower until it became a deep, vibrating hum. John opened his eyes and frowned. He had never heard a sound quite like this before. It did not sound like natural atmospheric noise. It sounded artificial, but wrong. The hum began to pulse. It would get loud, then quiet, then loud again. It sounded like the heavy breathing of a giant animal inside a deep cave. Every time the hum grew loud, it echoed, as if it were bouncing off endless walls. John leaned closer to the table. He reached out and tapped the glass of one of the vacuum tubes to make sure it was not broken. The tube was fine. The orange glow was steady. He gently tapped the crystal detector. The pulsing, echoing hum remained. It was a real signal. It was coming from outside the house. John's heart began to beat a little faster. This was what he lived for. He had found something completely new, something weird. He grabbed the small handle for the cat's whisker and made a microscopic adjustment, trying to make the bizarre frequency clearer. As he moved the wire, something very strange happened in the attic. The air in the room suddenly became freezing cold. It happened in the space of a single second. It was as if someone had opened a giant door to a winter storm right inside the room. John shivered violently. The heavy wool coat he wore usually kept him warm enough, but this cold went straight into his bones. He exhaled, and he saw his breath form a white cloud of mist in the dim yellow light. He stared at the mist, deeply confused. His attic was poorly insulated, but it had never dropped in temperature this fast. The sound in his headphones grew louder. The echoing hum began to break apart, turning into a heavy, crushing wall of static. But this static did not just sound loud in his ears. It felt heavy. It felt like pressure pushing against the sides of his head. John reached up and pulled one side of the headphones off his left ear. He expected to hear the quiet silence of his attic. Instead, he heard the static. He heard the exact same crushing, hissing sound in the open air of the room. The sound was not just inside the radio anymore. It was bleeding out into the physical world. John stared in shock at the centre of the room. The dust particles that normally floated gently through the yellow light were behaving very strangely. They were vibrating. They were spinning in tight, fast circles, matching the pulsing rhythm of the sound. The sharp smell of ozone in the room grew so strong it made John's eyes water. Suddenly, tiny blue sparks of electricity began to pop and snap in the empty air near the ceiling. They looked like tiny, brilliant fireflies, appearing and vanishing in a fraction of a second. The static was materializing physically in his own home. The radio waves were somehow becoming real, touching the air, the dust, and the temperature of the room. John was frightened, but his obsession was stronger than his fear. He wanted to know what was causing this. He quickly pushed the headphone pad back over his left ear. He grabbed the tuning dial and the cat's whisker at the same time. He focused all his skill and all his experience on clearing the signal. He moved his hands with tiny, delicate motions. He listened through the heavy pressure of the static. He heard a fluctuation in the noise. He adjusted the copper coil setting. The static broke apart. The echoing hum dropped into the background, and a voice came through the heavy noise. It was a man's voice. He was speaking English, but he did not sound like a newsman or a singer. He sounded completely terrified. His voice was shaking, cracking with raw emotion. He sounded like a man who had been screaming for days, his throat ruined and his spirit broken. He was speaking quickly, frantically, his words stumbling over each other. "Is anyone there?" the voice pleaded through the heavy static. "Can anyone hear me? Please, if you are listening, please answer me. I do not have much time. They are everywhere now. I'm the only one left. Please, God, someone answer me." John froze. His hand hovered over the tuning dial. He had never heard anything like this on the radio. Sometimes operators played jokes. Sometimes stations broadcast dramatic plays with actors pretending to be in danger. But this did not sound like an actor. There was a wet, choking sound in the man's throat. The panic was too real. The terror was too heavy. John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, mixing with the freezing air of the attic. "I do not know if this machine is even working anymore," the frantic voice continued, echoing slightly in the headphones. "The power grid died 4 days ago. I am running this transmitter on the last of my car batteries. If anyone is out there, you must listen to me. You must hide. You must not let them see your lights." John sat perfectly still. He wanted to speak back, but he only had a receiver. He could only listen. He could not transmit. He was forced to simply sit in the cold, dusty attic and listen to the desperate man. The blue sparks continued to pop in the air above John's head. The dust continued to spin in frantic circles. "It started a week ago," the voice on the radio said, dropping into a harsh, sobbing whisper. "The sky just went dark. It was Tuesday afternoon. 1 minute the sun was shining, and the next minute it was gone. It did not fade. It was just turned off. The whole world went black. We thought it was an eclipse. We thought it was a freak storm. We turned on the street lights. We lit candles in our homes. We told our children not to be afraid. We did not know." The man on the radio paused to take a ragged, gasping breath. John could hear the sound of something shifting in the background of the broadcast. It sounded like wood groaning. "The cold came next," the radio voice continued. "A cold so deep it cracked the glass in the windows. But the dark and the cold were not the real problem. The real problem was what came with the dark. The shadows that drink the light." John felt a deep shiver run down his spine. The phrase sent a wave of pure dread through him. The shadows that drink the light. He glanced nervously at the dark, unseen corners of his own attic, just beyond the reach of his single yellow bulb. "We thought they were just regular shadows at first," the frantic man explained, his voice rising in panic. "But when we lit the fires to stay warm, the shadows did not shrink away. They moved toward the flames. They stretched across the walls and the floors. They surrounded the fires, and then they smothered them. They ate the fire. They swallowed the light." The man began to cry quietly. The sound of his weeping mixed with the heavy echoing static of the strange frequency. "My neighbour, Mr. Henderson, he took a heavy flashlight and shined it at them," the man sobbed. "The beam of light hit the darkness, and the darkness just drank it. It sucked the light right out of the glass. And then the shadow crawled up the beam of light. It moved so fast, it crawled right up the light and wrapped around his arm. He screamed. God, he screamed so loud. The shadow covered his face. When it moved away, he was just gone. There was nothing left. They eat the light, and they eat the people who make the light. They hate us, but they need us to feed." John was breathing heavily now. His chest felt tight. The cold mist from his breath swirled in front of his face, mixing with the vibrating dust. The story was impossible. It was a nightmare. But the physical changes in his room told him that the signal was carrying something real, something incredibly powerful and dangerous. "My wife," the man on the radio whispered, his voice breaking completely. "My wife and my little girl. We tried to hide in the basement. We only had one candle. I told them not to light it. I told them we had to sit in the total blackness so the shadows would not find us. But it was so cold. My little girl was freezing. My wife lit the candle just for a minute to warm her hands. The shadows came out of the corners of the basement. They poured out like thick black water. I tried to fight them. You cannot fight a shadow. My hands went right through them, but when they touched my wife, they were solid. They were as cold as ice and as hard as stone. They drank the candlelight, and then they drank my family." The man wailed, a terrible, hopeless sound that made John close his eyes in sympathetic agony. "I ran," the man confessed to the empty air. "I left them and I ran. I ran up the stairs. I climbed into the attic. I bolted the door. I have been sitting in the dark ever since. But I had to turn on the tubes of this radio. I had to warn someone. The tubes make a soft orange glow. I know they can see it. I can hear them moving in the house. They are sliding along the walls. They are coming up the stairs." John's eyes snapped open. The man was in an attic. The man was using a radio with glowing orange vacuum tubes. The similarities were too close. John's mind raced. He had to know where this man was. He had to know where this broadcast was originating. John had a very special tool on his table for exactly this purpose. It was called a directional loop antenna. It was a large wooden hoop about 2 feet across, wrapped in dozens of turns of thin copper wire. It sat on a heavy wooden base that allowed it to spin in a full circle. By turning the hoop and listening to the volume of the signal, John could determine the exact geographical direction the radio waves were coming from. When the edge of the hoop pointed directly at the source, the signal would be at its absolute loudest. John reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the wooden edge of the loop antenna. He slowly began to rotate it on its base. As he turned it to the left, the desperate voice of the man and the heavy static began to fade, becoming quieter. John stopped and turned the hoop slowly back to the right. The volume increased. It grew louder and louder. The frantic voice filled his ears again. He kept turning the hoop until the signal reached its absolute peak volume. He stopped moving it. The hoop was now pointing straight ahead, toward the front wall of his attic. John grabbed a pencil and a small notebook from his table. He looked at the compass markings carved into the base of the antenna. He wrote down the direction, but a direction was only a line. To find a specific location, he needed to know the distance. John had modified his receiver with a crude signal strength meter. It was a small dial with a needle that moved based on how powerful the incoming radio waves were. The needle was currently pushed all the way to the right. It was slammed against the maximum peg. The signal was incredibly strong. It was not bouncing off the atmosphere from Europe or Asia. It was not coming from Chicago or New York. It was local. It was very, very local. John pulled a folded paper map of his town out of a drawer in the table. He spread it out under the dim yellow light. He found his own house on the map. He placed his pencil on his house and drew a straight line in the direction the antenna was pointing. The line went straight down his own street. John stared at the map. His mind struggled to make sense of the information. If the signal was coming from down the street, and it was this powerful, the transmitter had to be massive. But he knew all his neighbours. None of them had large radio towers. None of them even owned transmitting equipment. He was the only amateur operator in the area. He decided to double-check his reading. There was a trick he had learned to triangulate a signal using a second antenna wire strung outside his window. He quickly flipped a series of brass switches on his table to activate the outside wire. He checked the signal strength again and compared the phase difference between the two antennas. He performed a rapid, panicked calculation on his notepad. He found the distance. The pencil slipped from his fingers and rolled across the map. John felt all the blood drain from his face. His stomach dropped. The distance was 0. The signal was not coming from down the street. It was not coming from next door. The mathematics of the radio waves proved without a single doubt that the strongest point of the signal was exactly where the receiver was located. The broadcast was originating from the exact geographic coordinates of John's own house. The signal was coming from inside this very attic. But John was entirely alone. There was no other man in the room. There was no other radio transmitter. John looked at his equipment, looked at the map, and then looked at the empty air of his freezing room. A terrifying, impossible realization washed over his mind. He was not listening to a prank. He was not listening to a station in another city. The bizarre, echoing frequency he had tuned into was not travelling across physical space. It was travelling across realities. He had pushed his custom-built, highly sensitive radio past the limits of normal frequencies, and he had accidentally built a bridge. He was listening to another timeline. He was listening to a parallel version of Earth that occupied the exact same physical space as his own world, but separated by an invisible dimensional barrier. And that parallel Earth was currently dead. It was a timeline undergoing a total cosmic assimilation by an unimaginable horror. The shadows that drink the light were eating that version of the world. The desperate man on the radio was the parallel version of himself. He was listening to another John Baker in another attic. As soon as John realized this, the physical bleed-over in his room became violently worse. The barrier between the two timelines was thinning because the radio connection was holding the door open. The heavy, crushing static grew deafening in his headphones. The air in his attic dropped even further in temperature. The white mist of his breath now turned into tiny crystals of ice that fell onto the wooden table. The blue sparks, crackling near the ceiling, multiplied, turning into small webs of wild electricity. And then the light began to fail. The single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered violently. Its bright yellow glow dimmed to a sickly, pale brown. On the table, the 4 large glass vacuum tubes began to lose their warm orange fire. The light inside the glass began to shrink, as if something invisible was pressing against it, pushing the light back down into the metal filaments. John gasped in terror. The shadows in the corners of his own attic were beginning to change. The normal, natural darkness where the light bulb could not reach started to look thicker. It looked like black water pooling in the corners of the ceiling and the floor. The shadows were slowly beginning to stretch. They were creeping forward, inch by inch, sliding along the wooden floorboards toward the center of the room. They were crawling toward the dimming light bulb. They were crawling toward the fading orange tubes of the radio. They were bleeding through the frequency. On the radio, the frantic man suddenly stopped crying. The terrible, hopeless wailing cut off in the middle of a sob. There was a moment of heavy, echoing silence on the frequency, filled only by the sound of the breathing static. Then the man took a deep, shuddering breath. When he spoke again, his voice was entirely different. He did not sound like he was shouting a blind plea out to a wide audience anymore. He sounded like he was speaking directly into the ear of a specific person. He was speaking intimately. He was speaking with total, horrifying certainty. "John Baker," the voice on the radio said. John's heart completely stopped in his chest. His eyes went wide. He stopped breathing. "They hear the machine, John," the voice whispered through the heavy static. The voice was incredibly close. It did not sound like it was coming through the headphones anymore. It sounded like the man was standing right behind John's chair. They followed the signal back through the empty space. They followed it back to the glowing tubes. They are crossing over. The door is open. John's hands gripped the wooden edges of his table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. His whole body was trembling, but he could not move a single muscle. He was paralyzed by a fear so deep and so absolute that it stripped away his ability to think. "They are already in the room with you, John?" the parallel voice whispered softly. "They are sliding out of the dark. They are in the corners of your attic right now. They are stretching out toward your back. Whatever you do, John, please, do not turn around." The voice on the radio cut out with a sharp, brutal click. The frequency went completely dead. The heavy, rushing static vanished. Total silence fell over the headphones, but the silence in the physical room was broken. Behind John's back, in the deep corners of the freezing attic, he could hear a sound. It was the sound of thick, heavy cloth dragging slowly across the wooden floorboards. It was the sound of something cold and completely solid shifting in the dark. The single light bulb above his head gave one final, weak flicker, and then the filament popped. The bulb went completely dark. The only light left in the freezing room was the very faint, dying orange glow of the 4-glass vacuum tubes on the table in front of him. John sat completely frozen in his wooden chair. He did not let go of the table. He did not take off his headphones. He stared straight ahead at the brass dials and the copper coils of his machine. The dragging sound behind him grew slightly louder, moving closer to the back of his chair. He could feel a cold that was worse than winter radiating against his neck. He sat there, locked in the dying light, absolutely terrified to look at the corners of his attic.